Hi. The next section of Pieper's book, The Christian Idea of Man, deals with courage and the fear of the Lord. This is the section of the book that first inspired me to think about doing this video series. There's lots of great stuff in this part. At the end of this video, I will show you the first philosophy book I ever purchased. It's on the shelf behind me right now, in fact. Let's begin with a definition of courage. Pieper says that courage is readiness to accept harm for the sake of realizing the good. And we'll begin with justice and courage. There are two errors about justice and courage that are common today, Pieper says. First, the supposition that one can be just without the need for courage. And Pieper notes that in this world, no good succeeds on its own, of itself, without personal commitment, up to and including a willingness to risk death for it. And this may seem obvious, but I think it's actually a fairly profound point, that the way this world is, there is no self-realizing good, no good that simply works itself out on autopilot. All good requires the personal commitment of a moral agent to implement it, to achieve it, to realize it, and that means taking risk. It means that each of us must be willing to sacrifice some of our own good, up to and including our own life, for the sake of the good. Without that risk, there can be no realization of any good, including justice. The second error is to suppose that one can be courageous without justice. Pieper says we can only call something courage when justice is its goal. He quotes Aquinas saying that when I praise a man's courage, I also praise his justice. So we might say that terrorists or criminals are bold or audacious, but we would not call them courageous. So we should note here that even in the moral concept and the moral language that Pieper is using, this language of virtue, it is not content neutral. We might even ask ourselves, for further discussion, why is it that we feel a desire to have a content neutral concept for describing moral behavior? This seems to me to strip our moral language of its normative function and to make it relative to the acting will or to the social context. This is not the way with Pieper's virtue ethics. To call something courageous is to speak inevitably of its orientation toward justice and toward the good overall. The next section of this part deals with what I'll call fear and the horrible. So let's begin by thinking about fear. How do we react to trauma, to the truly horrible things in human life? Well, one way, Pieper observes, is with the kind of daily chatter, the sort of chit-chat of daily life, daily routine, and that allows us to forget the horror of life, the really bad things in life. So I may not want to think about those children who were murdered the other day. I'll mow my lawn instead. I'll go do something that is routine. The more routine it is, the more it embeds me in a sort of average everydayness, the more I feel I'm able to hide temporarily from my knowledge and thought about the horrible. Pieper also says in his own time, 1949, there's rising something that he calls the New Stoicism. The sense that even though Europe has been through two shattering wars, even though there is worse to come potentially in what we call the Cold War, we all bear hardships, but we can bear up underneath it, and through our strength we can build a better world. This sort of optimism of the new modern mid-20th century Stoic. Pieper says that this view of life contains in it an answer to the metaphysical situation of the West today. He even says it may be a better answer than a Christian answer which rests complacent in old certainties and thus fails to address the current metaphysical situation. What the New Stoics are onto, Pieper says, is something like fear of the Lord, but they are secularizing it and thus distort it and disconnecting it from the reality that it represents. So what is fear of the Lord? First, fear of the Lord is not just respect for the Lord. We might say, well, fear of the Lord is just a fancy way of saying, well, we honor and respect God, we recognize his place. Pieper says no. Fear of the Lord is real, actual fear. So let's get that straight first. Fear, what is fear? Fear is a response to a threatened diminution of my being. Ultimately, what I fear might be my annihilation, the sort of total destruction of my being, but anything that diminishes my being, I react to with fear. Now, to be reasonable, I should apportion my fear according to the diminution's degree and quality in a sort of hierarchy of fear. I should fear those things which are most fearsome in themselves the most, and I should not fear too much or out of proportion things that represent a relatively minor threat to my being. So what is the truly most fearsome thing in human existence? What is it that diminishes my being the most? And here's a quote from Pieper. He says, "The ultimately terrible is nothing other than the possibility that the person, through guilt, willingly separates himself from the ultimate ground of being." The possibility of incurring this guilt is the most extreme danger of human existence. And fear of the Lord is the appropriate rational response to this danger. Pieper next makes a few observations about this fear. First, the danger of incurring this level of guilt is a danger for all people, including the saint. And so fear of the Lord is a virtue for all people. Second, this fear cannot be overcome by any form of heroism. It's not the case that one becomes heroic or strong enough so as to leave fear of the Lord behind. Rather, he says, it seems to be a precondition for heroism, proper heroism of any sort. Third, fear must be borne until the certainty of eternal life. And this suggests to me that this is not just a fear for every person, but it's also a fear for every moment of every person's life. An observation of my own that I'll add at this point is that I think what Pieper is describing as fear of the Lord may be the reality that the existential idea of angst is dimly grasping for, that sense of generalized, delocalized anxiety, disquiet in one's being. It may in fact be a kind of fear of the Lord that doesn't recognize itself as such. It's an awareness that one has the possibility of incurring this guilt that separates one from the ground of one's being. Only human beings are capable of potentially tearing themselves apart at this level, and so only human beings feel angst. Pieper's fourth observation here is that fear of the Lord is the negative side of hope in and love of God. So as I grow in fear of the Lord, I also grow in love of God. These two things go together. It's a filial fear, relationship to a father figure. Next, let me talk about the relation of this fear to nature. Fear of the Lord is the completion of our natural human fear of diminution and annihilation, says Pieper. It builds off of our natural fear of nothingness. And there are some parallels that are quite interesting here. Pieper says, considering the virtues we've already talked about, our natural desire to live in society is perfected in the virtue of justice. And our natural desire to aggrandize ourselves, to say, hey, look at me, is perfected in the virtue of magnanimity. And our natural desire for enjoyment, for pleasure, is perfected in the virtue of moderation. Now I say, look at what all three of these things have in common, is that the virtue is what we acquire, it's what we achieve when reason assumes the throne in governing this part of our lives. I enjoy pleasure, I enjoy pleasant things, but when I'm fully rational about it, when I'm prudent, when I apportion my enjoyment and give it the proper place in my overall life, knowing the full reality around me, I practice the virtue of moderation. The same thing with justice in social relations. So with this structure in place, we should recognize that our natural fear of nothingness is perfected in fear of the Lord. And if it's not perfected, like the other natural drives, it can turn destructive. And perhaps angst, which I spoke about a moment ago, is a defective or destructive form of this natural fear of nothingness, if it doesn't achieve the rule of reason in the virtue of fear of the Lord. Pieper also notes at the end of this section that ultimately fear of the Lord is a gift of the Holy Spirit. And so it is only with God's supernatural help that we can live healthy lives, free from the tyranny of this unfulfilled, undirected fear. So in these virtues, justice, moderation, filial fear, we find true psychological health, holiness, and connection to reality united. That is, we find the psychological, the spiritual, and the philosophical all converging in a picture of moral and psychological and philosophical health. That's all I have to say about this section. We'll talk about the next section next week. Now, let me show you the book I promised. It is back here on the shelf. It is this book, The Giving and Taking of Life by James Tunstall Birchall. I bought this book more than 30 years ago. Birchall was a theologian at the University of Notre Dame. And this was the first book I bought, philosophy book I bought with my own money, simply because I wanted to read it. It wasn't for any class or for anything else. I may even have bought this back in high school. I was curious about the topic. It's ethical essays from a number of different sources. The essay in this book that really stuck with me, that I still think about periodically today, is this one, The Child as Chattel. And it's about sexual ethics, and it's Birchall's meditations on Humanae Vitae, and a missed opportunity, he says, perhaps, instead of focusing upon the natural and artificial distinction in reproductive technology, there was an opportunity, he thinks, for the church to speak more about radical hospitality and the attitude that we take towards children and other radically dependent persons in our life. Maybe I'll reread that essay and do a video about it sometime, but the insights and some of the thoughts in that essay are things I've thought about quite a lot in the decades since then. So that's my first philosophy book ever, The Giving and Taking of Life by James Tunstall Birchall. That's all I have for you for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.